13. That is the number I kept coming back to. Not the original 13 colonies. Everyone knows those. I mean the 13 states that appeared on American maps between 1850 and 1890. States that didn't exist one generation earlier. States that were carved out of land that was already occupied, already named, already governed by people whose entire civilization had to be made invisible before the paperwork could be filed. I wasn't looking for this when I started. I was tracing land grant records, trying to understand how the federal government distributed territory in the decades following the Mexican-American War. Standard research. The kind of thing that should produce clean answers. Instead, it produced a question I couldn't shake. Before these states existed, what was there? Not in theory, not in the romantic frontier mythology that fills every American history textbook from the 4th grade onward. Actually, specifically, documentably, what was there? And where did it go? The official story goes like this. America expanded westward through a combination of purchase, treaty, and settlement. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the nation's size overnight. The Mexican Cession in 1848 added California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming in a single transaction. The Oregon Treaty with Britain gave America the Pacific Northwest without a shot being fired. Settlers moved in, territories were organized, populations grew to the threshold required for statehood, states were admitted, progress marched forward. That story is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that becomes more disturbing the closer you look at it. Here is what the official story skips. The moment you examine the actual census records from the territories before statehood, you find populations that don't match the narrative. Not small discrepancies, not rounding errors, structural ones. The kind that suggest the accounting was never designed to be accurate in the first place. Take Kansas. Kansas became a state in 1861. The 1860 census counted its population at just over 100,000 people. But that census explicitly excluded native populations from its count. It excluded Mexican land grant holders whose families had lived on that territory for generations before the Mexican-American War transferred it to the United States. It excluded Chinese laborers who had arrived to build the infrastructure that settlement required. The 100,000 figure counted only the people the government had decided counted. Everyone else was simply not in the number. In 1854, when Kansas Territory was organized, the federal government negotiated treaties with 12 separate tribal nations who held legal claim to that land. Formal treaties, signed documents, legal agreements bearing the signatures of United States government representatives who had the authority to make binding commitments on behalf of the nation. Within 6 years, every single one of those 12 nations had been relocated. The treaties had guaranteed them territory. The territory was then renegotiated, reduced, renegotiated again, reduced again. By the time Kansas achieved statehood, the land those treaties had protected had been redistributed to settlers through the Homestead Act and the railroad land grants. And here is what bothers me about that sequence. The treaties still existed. They were filed. They were legal documents bearing the signatures of United States government representatives. They didn't disappear. They were simply superseded, quietly, through a combination of new legislation and selective non-enforcement, until the original agreements became historical footnotes rather than binding law, until the land they had protected became the land that the new state was built on, until the people they had protected became the absence that nobody in the official record was required to explain. But Kansas is just one example. The pattern repeats across every state admitted during this period with a consistency that cannot be attributed to coincidence. Minnesota achieved statehood in 1858. 2 years later, in 1862, the Dakota War erupted when the federal government failed to deliver the treaty-guaranteed food payments that had been promised to the Dakota people in exchange for ceding most of their territory. The payments didn't come because the funds had been redirected, because the agents responsible for dispersing them had other priorities, because the mechanism for accountability between the promise and the delivery was inadequate by design. People were starving. The payments didn't come. The war that followed resulted in the largest mass execution in American history. 38 Dakota men were hanged simultaneously in Mankato, Minnesota on December 26, 1862. President Lincoln personally reviewed the case files and approved the executions. The remaining Dakota population was expelled from Minnesota entirely by congressional act. Their reservation lands were dissolved and redistributed within months of the executions. The state that had been built on treaty land resolved the treaty obligations by eliminating the treaty holders. Nebraska, admitted in 1867. Nevada, 1864. Colorado, 1876. The Dakotas, divided into two states in 1889, specifically because dividing them would add 2 Republican senators to Congress rather than 1. The line between North and South Dakota was drawn on a map in Washington by men who had never stood on that ground, who had no relationship to the people who had lived there, and who chose the division based entirely on its implications for Senate arithmetic. Now, here is where it gets strange. When you look at the land records from this period, specifically the General Land Office surveys that preceded every territorial organization, you find something that official histories treat as routine, but that stops making sense the moment you examine it closely. Before land could be distributed to settlers, it had to be surveyed. Before it could be surveyed, it had to be legally cleared. Before it could be legally cleared, existing claims had to be extinguished. The word extinguished appears in General Land Office documents with remarkable frequency. Extinguishing a claim meant buying it, negotiating it away, or in cases where neither was possible, simply declaring it void through legal mechanisms that the government controlled and the claimants did not. The documentation of how those claims were extinguished is incomplete in ways that follow a pattern too consistent to be accidental. Treaty negotiations are well documented on the government side. The terms, the signatories, the ratification records, those survive in the National Archives with reasonable completeness. What doesn't survive with the same consistency is the documentation of what happened after the treaties were signed, where the relocated populations actually went, whether the annuity payments promised in exchange for land cessions were actually delivered to the people they were promised to, whether the alternative territories described in the treaties were the territories that the relocated populations actually received, whether the populations that the treaties had protected were tracked at all after the treaties were superseded. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, established in 1824 and transferred to the Department of the Interior in 1849, was the agency responsible for administering treaty obligations and tracking the populations those treaties affected. Its records from the 1850 to 1890 period are among the most significant archives in American history. They are also among the most inconsistently preserved archives in American history. The agencies within the Bureau with the least complete records were consistently the ones operating in territories that experienced the most rapid settler expansion during the same period. The places where documentation was most needed were the places where documentation was least maintained. This is not a coincidence that the official record explains. It is a pattern the official record has never been required to address. The 1890 census was the first census in American history to attempt a comprehensive and systematic count of Native American populations. It was designed with individual schedules that recorded tribal affiliation, land allotment status, and citizenship classification for each person counted. It was also taken immediately after the completion of the final major land cessions of the Western expansion period, which means it would have provided, for the first time, a baseline measurement of where the relocated populations had actually ended up after decades of displacement. It would have allowed a researcher to compare the territories described in the treaties against the territories where the populations actually appeared in the census. It would have made visible in a single consolidated document the full scope of the gap between what the treaties had promised and what the people those treaties protected had actually received. That census was destroyed before anyone could perform that comparison systematically. The General Land Office records that survived the era tell a different story than the settlement mythology. Between 1862 and 1890, the federal government distributed approximately 270 million acres of land through the Homestead Act alone. Railroad companies received an additional 170 million acres in federal land grants along the routes of the transcontinental and branch lines. That is 440 million acres transferred from federal ownership to private hands in less than 30 years. 440 million acres that had to come from somewhere. The official answer is that it came from the public domain, land that belonged to the federal government through purchase and treaty. But the public domain was itself assembled through those same treaties, those same extinguished claims, those same relocations that left incomplete documentation at every turn. The land was legally cleared on paper. What happened to the people whose presence had made clearing necessary is a question the paperwork was never designed to answer. The General Land Office employed thousands of surveyors between 1850 and 1890. Those surveyors walked the land before the settlers arrived. They recorded what they found. Their field notes, which survive in the National Archives in greater completeness than almost any other record from this period, describe a landscape that was already organized, already inhabited, already in use. Settlements, cultivated fields, established roads, cemeteries, structures of various kinds, evidence of populations that had been living on this land for generations before the surveys were drawn. And then the survey was completed. The land was classified as public domain, and the thing that had been documented in the field notes, the settlements, the fields, the roads, the cemeteries, simply ceased to exist in the official record. Not because it was destroyed, not because anyone formally denied that it had been there, but because the classification system that converted surveyed territory into distributable public domain had no category for settled populations whose claims had not been formally extinguished through treaty. The surveyors saw what was there. Their notes recorded it. The classification that followed erased it from the legal record, and the gap between what the field notes documented and what the official land records acknowledged is the gap in which 13 states were built. Several of the states admitted during this period contain within their current boundaries county names, river names, township names, and geographic designations derived from the nations and peoples who were relocated to create space for those states. Iowa is derived from the Iowa people, Illinois from the Illinois Confederation, Minnesota from the Dakota word for sky-tinted water, Kansas from the Kansa people. The names survived when the people were removed. The geography remembers what the history books minimize. Maybe this is all just the inevitable arithmetic of expansion. Maybe every nation that has ever grown has done so at the expense of whoever occupied the territory before it arrived. Maybe the incomplete documentation is nothing more than the natural result of 19th century record-keeping applied to an unprecedented scale of territorial organization without adequate administrative infrastructure. I considered all of those explanations. I held them as seriously as the evidence required. But I cannot look at the pattern without asking the question the pattern demands. 13 states were added to the Union between 1850 and 1890. Each one required land. Each one required that land to be legally cleared before it could be distributed. Each clearing required documentation, and at every point where that documentation would have allowed a comprehensive accounting of what was lost and who lost it, the records are incomplete, sealed, destroyed before their contents could be analyzed, or simply never created in a form that preserved the connection between the treaty promise and the treaty outcome. The states exist. The names on the land are different now. The field notes are still in the National Archives describing what was there before the surveys made it disappear into the public domain. And no official body, no congressional commission, no federal review, no comprehensive historical accounting has ever produced a document that explains what those 13 states were built on, or what happened to every population that the surveys displaced to make room for them. The records won't tell you. The states themselves won't tell you. The federal government has never been required to tell you. But the names are still there, written into the geography of a country that replaced the people who gave those names to the land while keeping the names themselves as permanent reminders of what was erased. The land remembers even when the history doesn't. If you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.